Welcome to this very important webinar on sanctions, a sanctioned world, a crime normalized, voices from sanctioned nations. My name is Liz Remerswell. I'm with World Beyond War, and I'm in Aotearoa, New Zealand, a country operates under the Treaty of Waitangi in cooperation with Māori, and I am on Te Matua Māori Ngāti Kāinunu country. Welcome to everybody who has joined, and especially our special guests who are going to be speaking about sanctions in Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, Palestine, and Cuba. As has already been mentioned, there is translations into Spanish, and so if you click at the bottom of your screen where it says interpretation, you will be able to access those. So thank you to Gabrielle. And this program is being recorded, so it will be able to be shared later on. So talking about sanctions, as you all know, the US government imposes broad sanctions on dozens of nations, punishing populations in violation of the Geneva Conventions, supposedly in order to influence or overthrow their governments, although that is never the result. The result is horrible suffering and death. Applying economic sanctions is a warlike act and often kills more people than actual weapons. Moreover, these sanctions hurt the poorest and most vulnerable sections of society by causing hunger, disease, and unemployment. They are explicitly designed to do so. The US government also has forced other countries to obey its sanctions regime against targeted states through the use of extraterritoriality, that is, by penalizing foreign corporations that dare to trade with countries which the USA has sanctioned. Humanitarian goods such as medical supplies, which are exempted from economic sanctions under international law, have consistently been denied to countries such as Iran and Venezuela. That the US government would actually increase the sanctions against those two countries during the recent pandemic is simply barbaric. So to start with today, a welcome Luis Delgado Aria from Venezuela. Luis is a university professor, researcher, poet, and essayist. He has a degree in literature from the Central University of Venezuela and a Magister Scientiarum in Arts from the University of Pittsburgh. He is the author of various books and articles on decolonial philosophy, communication, political advocacy, cognitive warfare, and analysis of media and political discourse. Founder and host of several opinion programs on AMTV, and he currently serves as Vice Director of Research and Intellectual Creation at the International Communications University. He directs a collective investigation for the construction of political counter-hegemony in Venezuela. Welcome, Luis. Hola.
Hola, buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Muy honrado con la invitación que nos están haciendo. Queremos felicitar por la iniciativa de hacer una acción concreta en defensa de los pueblos y sobre todo de los sectores más humildes de los pueblos, que es a quien en definitiva fundamentalmente atacan este tipo de medidas. Creo que solamente con una acción internacionalista,
through an international action, through an action where victims get together and speak about it, it's a way to make people understand what is going on and to have a fair treatment to these peoples. The kind of offensive that is being triggered to our peoples is transnational, and somehow is a capitalist blockage against our peoples. And it's very important to understand the scope and the severity of these sanctions and the consequences of these kinds of measures. That's why we thank you. We thank this organization and all the people who are cooperating. And from the International University of Communications, we are working on a path to rethink the severity and importance of these new ways of war against our people, and also to find a way to overcome the severity of these kinds of sanctions. The first thing I want to do with these 10 minutes that I have is to make a clarification in terms of the categories we are using to be able to understand the phenomena. As we know, words are not neutral, and the fact that these kinds of sanctions are being called sanctions in itself, it's it is got an ideological charged, an ideological concept. So I think it's counterproducing to call these kinds of actions sanctions, because the noun sanctions comes from the Latin word, which is a sanction or sanctionis, and it means a law, a decree, a constitution, or a statute. It means, this word means to law legitimacy, but also the verb, it comes from, it means to sanctify. That's the etymology of the word. In other words, sanction, in its own meaning, is a legitimacy by law, and on the other hand, the consecration or something, you know, the theology behind it. Meaning it's not only law legitimacy, but also ideology. So the first thing that I want to propose, or my proposal, is to review the word sanction. At first I thought we had to talk about maybe instead of talking about a package of sanctions, we should talk about a war of sanctions. But still, a war of sanctions is still has the original sin of, you know, being very cordial. I think we're more, you know, to use the right word or to use a different word, or we can call it to answer to certain policies from international entities that call these kinds of measurements coercitive, unilateral coercive measures. I think that's debatable, you know, that concept, because these are measures, and they are unilateral. They're really not unilateral, because they are actions that are being made by a whole of, or by a group of countries or governments that get together. So they have a Western characteristic, if I may. And on the other hand, they're not measures, and they're not unilateral. And the coercitive or coercion is also strange, because we don't know what that word means. Our peoples don't know. So calling an action of war, that's what it should be called by all media, with all with the premeditation, with superiority and power. Those are the other characteristics of this crime. So calling this package of war actions against the poorest from the most powerful on earth, it's got a very grave, and it requires a better conceptualization, categorization, and to rethink the way we are digesting these kinds of politics or policies, and to agree on how we start to answer together and more systemically and more powerful to this. And it starts out from rebaptizing things with the real name. The important part of this is for people to understand that we are at war, the nature of the war, because this war, as stated in an article from the university, and it's called the gray narrative. In the case of the collapsing of the whole Western system, and specifically the capitalism, this crisis where certain things that should die do not die, and certain things that should be born are not born. So in this gray area where these monsters appear, some of them are the nonsense, the monsters of a kind of war that, since we're not seeing bombs falling down or missiles falling down or tanks, we say, oh, no, we're not at war, you know. And people do not understand why things like what happened in Venezuela happened. In Venezuela, we were victims of measures or actions of war, you know, through the international law, through restrictions to finance, to commerce, to economy, restrictions to credit, prohibition of people leaving the country, you know, mostly all of the civil servants from the different branches of the government. So what they have done against Venezuelan people is war without restriction, in which there has been no part of the society where they haven't used it to harm us. If you read the 195 actions of war defined by James Chan in his book, and in Venezuela, they have applied more than the ones in the book of subversive actions to create revolutions. So this war has had Venezuela was a country that was forced by the capitalist world system to be to get into the logic of market logic in the place of an oil producer for the West, mainly oil. That was the role that was given to us by the international work system. And somehow we were forced to continue being or acting that role. Then war of sanctions comes and it turns the world upside down to take apart the historical position of Venezuela as oil producer. And you know that we depend 99% on oil, of the income from oil. And Venezuela in 5 or 5 years was taken or was taken to have a fall in the income of 99%. So out of 100 barrels of oil, we went back to have just one barrel sold at income from 1 barrel. This is just one measure that no country in the world has had, and no country in the world has gone bankruptcy because of these kinds of measures. Former ambassador in Venezuela from the United States, William Bromfield, said, we know, open quotes, we know that sanctioning PDVSA, Venezuelan National Petroleum Company, is going to hurt not only the government, but also the common people, and it's going to last months or years. But what is convenient right now, he said, is to go deeper into that situation to make it collapse, to make the society in Venezuela collapse and the Maduro president regime to collapse. So war is not against it's not against a regime, it's against the people. People who have elected for 2 decades to support an exit to the hell of neoliberalism and capitalism, and that has voted, despite the lies on the media and misinformation, despite all of this, despite the opposition, and despite all weaknesses we had in our system. So in spite of that, the people has answered with the willingness and spirit. Not that we have had dire consequences amongst those. Just want to mention some of them. One of the most critical ones, when you affect 99% income of a country, you affect everything. Venezuela was the example in Latin America, fighting poverty. Sorry, Professor, could you lower your camera? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I was saying that in Venezuela, we were, with Hugo Chavez's government, we were congratulated by the United Nations and by the World Hunger Program to have reached the accomplishments of the millennium in less time than expected. And we reduced poverty to less than a third in less than 15 years. Sorry, in less than 10 years. All of that, the metaphor when Obama applied the first sanctions is that there were governments that had to be bent down. They had to be, they had to squeeze our necks, basically asphyxiate us, politically, industrially, economically, to limit access to medications, during the pandemic, the spare parts for all cars, to prohibit the possibility to refinance our debt. But not only that, they decided to do something similar to what they did with Libya when they took away, when they robbed all of their reserves, all of their money reserves in gold. We they sent even terrorists to try to capture or to kidnap the president. They even tried to bombard him with drones, who was with the whole group of secretaries, with the generals for the army, the cleric, and the parliament. So that was the extent of the measures against. So we see there is a project that wants not only to make it difficult or maybe to erase the bad example, as they said it, of the axis of evil, as they called it, because of our support to Cuba and Palestine and the Russian Federation, the Chinese. But there was an idea of erasing from the map anything that had to do with being the first example of rightly elected left government, not only to promote the development of a country such as Venezuela. You know, if we have wealth in Venezuela, oil, we got enough oil to have Venezuela living with a budget that is equivalent to the one of Argentina for 100 years without producing anything else. We are an ocean of oil, the biggest in the world, basically, or one of the biggest.
Que debajo de ese gran océano de petróleo hay otro océano de iguales proporciones.
And it is said that under our ocean of oil in the Orinoquia region, we still have another one underneath. So we do have the wealth in oil, one of the biggest in the world, which is equivalent to or even above. It's above of all the international reserves of all the countries in the world, but it's also superior to all the venture capital or the funds of all the billionaires in the world. That's all we have. Sorry, Professor, to interrupt you, but the time has finished. I'm sorry, if you could close your comment, please, in 1 minute. Yeah, definitely. What I wanted to say is that even though, or in spite of all these circumstances, it is said that we are a failure state, that we are bandits, and that we should be left alone. You know, as the Soviet Union was left alone when they had their revolution, and as Cuba was left alone, but Venezuela continues thriving and struggling, and we are getting out of it, not because the sanctions were lifted, but because women in Venezuela, especially women, have faced this challenge and have answered to it as it should be, along with the government, in an exemplary way. I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was a wonderful introduction and learning a lot about Venezuela. By the way, if you've got any questions, you're welcome to add them in the chat or ask them afterwards. So please just add your questions. Our next speaker is Professor Fouad Izzadi, who is from Iran and who is currently in China, and I believe it's 2 a.m. in the morning. So thank you very much, Fouad, for losing your sleep for this webinar. And so Fouad is a member of the board of directors of World Beyond War, and his research and teaching interests are interdisciplinary and focus on United States and Iran relations and US public diplomacy. His book, United States Public Diplomacy Towards Iran, discusses the United States communication efforts in Iran during the George W. Bush and Obama administrations. Fouad has published numerous studies in national and international academic journals and major handbooks, including Journal of Communication Inquiry, Journal of Arts Management, Law and Society, Routledge Handbook of Public Diplomacy, and Edward Algar Handbook of Cultural Security. And he is an associate professor at the Department of American Studies, Faculty of World Studies, University of Tehran, where he teaches MA and PhD courses in American Studies. Welcome, Fouad.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, David, for all your efforts. This is obviously a very important topic. Millions of people affected daily because of illegal sanctions against companies, the countries that are presented here. One option we have is we just replace Iran in Professor Luis's speech. We put Iran instead of Venezuela, and we can repeat this speech, and I can go back to sleep. So that's one option we have, because the situation of Iran and Venezuela are quite similar. But since I'm still awake, let me make a few remarks. The first point that I have deals with the issue of the reason behind sanctions. Why do we have sanctions against some countries and don't have sanctions against other countries? And as both Liz and Professor Lewis mentioned, this is a question of politics. So if there's a country that is a client state of the United States or is in line with US foreign policy dictates, then no matter what happens in that country, the only thing they would not have is sanctions. No sanctions for dictatorships that are in line with US foreign policy objectives. And sanctions for countries that are trying to have an independent foreign policy. So that's the basic premise. What are sanctions are supposed to achieve? They're supposed to put pressure on ordinary citizens, and I underline the word ordinary, because generally sanctions don't affect the higher segments of society in different countries. Generally, poorer segments of society, the middle class, are affected by sanctions. So the idea is that if you put enough pressure on these segments of society, since they're the biggest segment of society in any society, then they will get tired of sanctions and economic difficulties. They come to the streets and they engage in what is generally called a color revolution to overthrow the government. And this aim is what has been the objective of the US government towards Venezuela and Iran. The other point that I think needs to be addressed here is the fact that with the case of Iran, and I think it's probably true with Venezuela and other countries that are represented here, but I know this for Iran, the sanctions are not international sanctions, meaning they are not designated by the United Nations. We have no economic sanctions on Iran that is part of a UN resolution. So the sanctions that are affecting Iranian people are American sanctions, the laws that are passed by the United States Congress. But in practice, because of US economic power, companies that want to deal with Iran are not interested in engaging Iran economically because they're afraid of the law that was passed by the United States Congress. For example, I mean, China today, there are Chinese companies that would want to engage with Iran, and there are no difficulties between Iran and Chinese governments. But these companies are very much hesitant, and the reason is that they have seen other companies in earlier years that have engaged with Iran. They have come under American sanctions. And with those sanctions, these companies cannot deal with any other country in the world. That's the basic problem, that they lose their ability to do international business because of the fact that dollar is an important currency. And if you're put under US sanctions, you lose access to dollar. And we have, as we speak today, organizations like United Against Nuclear Iran. It's an American organization. They write letters to different companies all over the world on a daily basis, threatening them to stop working with Iran. Because if they don't, then these are facilitators of American sanctions. They contact someone in the US government and they cause difficulties for that company. So that is why we have sanctions. achieve some cheap foreign policy goal. This year, 2023, as you know, marks the 70th anniversary of the 1953 coup in Iran. And American and British sanctions on Iran started 70 years ago. And the crime of Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran's prime minister in 1953, was to nationalize Iranian oil. Before he took that act, the demand that he had from the British that were controlling Iranian oil was to share the wealth, the the income that the British had from Iranian oil, share it 50-50, fair and square, they say in the United States. The idea was to basically come up with a mechanism to engage in a win-win situation. That was Mossadegh's primary thought. And the British refused. And the US government supported the British government. And the result was that they ended up with a CIA MI6 coup against Mossadegh. And they brought back the Shah that engaged in a lot of crimes that we don't have time to go through. So this is why, and they had all the sanctions against Mossadegh's government. So that's why we have sanctions, to achieve some cheap foreign policy. And you see that today, as you remember, in 2015, the excuse that the United States has had against Iran was Iran's nuclear program. And there was an agreement on Iran's nuclear program in 2015. Everybody was happy. The United States said this is a good agreement. Iran accepted the agreement, followed the agreement. And it was the United States that left the agreement in 2018 without any justification. They couldn't say Iran is not following the agreement because Iran was following the agreement. And it's been more than 2 years since President Biden is in office, and he refuses to return to the agreement, basically following what Trump started. So there are a lot of disagreements between Republicans and Democrats, but when it comes to Iran and sanctioning Iran, they all agree and they continue this policy of sanctions. So since we don't have a lot of time, what I want to encourage our viewers to do is to read a report by a United Nations official rapporteur that came to Iran last year. And her job was to visit the country and look at the issue of sanctions and the effects that the sanctions have on Iranian people. The report is available at the UN site. I will try to get the link and post it online for people to be able to read it. It's a long report. It's about 20 pages or so. If you don't have time to read the whole report, just read the conclusion and recommendations of the report. It's written by a professor, actually, that was designated by United Nations to come to Iran, Elena Duhan. And she goes through a very detailed explanation of what sanctions are doing to Iran. Since we don't have a lot of time, let me just point one fact that is available in her report, and that's with regard to medicine and medical equipment. You know, under US Congress's sanctions against Iran, humanitarian goods and food and medicine is supposed to be exempt. So what's going on in practice? Are they exempt? The answer is yes and no. yes, on paper, they are exempt on the paper because the sanctions laws say that they are supposed to be exempt, and no in practice. And how is that? The reason in practice they are not exempt is because of the banking sanctions against Iran. So if Iran wants to import food or medicine using its own money, then no banks are able to get payment from Iran, because when you want to import something, you have to pay for it. And if you cannot pay for it, then you cannot get it. And because of the banking sanctions, in practice, everything is sanctioned, even food and medicine when it comes to Iran. And you saw an example of this a few weeks ago. After many years, Iran was allowed to access its own money in South Korea, about $6 billion. And then there was a few weeks of very difficult banking transactions for Iran to actually be able to use this money. The money went from South Korea to Switzerland, and then it went to Qatar in Persian Gulf. And just in the last few days, there are some ways of using that money for food and medicine. So it shouldn't be so difficult. The money in South Korean banks should be able to be accessed by Iran to buy food and medicine. You don't have to go through all these difficulties. And the reason you have to go through all these difficulties is because of the practice of sanctions. So what should be done since we are running out of time? I think this type of webinars are actually quite helpful, because we are facing an empire of lies. The Western corporate media outlets don't tell you all these facts. They try to demonize countries. They try to engage in black propaganda, basically. There's a lot of misinformation available. And they are actually talking about sanctions in a way that they are saying we are putting sanctions on these countries because of human rights issues. So it's totally the other way. The sanctions are causing serious difficulties for ordinary citizens. So information, correct information and data is going to be very important. That's why I like this UN report, because it goes through very detailed information on Iran. And I think the UN has done this for some other countries. So the issue of effects of sanctions on citizens is not only an Iranian problem. It's a problem internationally. As far as the last time I counted, more than 30 countries have been sanctioned by the United States. And so the information is going to be important. And then once people have the information, doing something about what they just learned is going to be important. Spreading the information. I understand this recording is going to be available on YouTube, and there are some people online. So spreading the information is going to be important. It is difficult for a handful of people to fight this propaganda empire. I understand it's very difficult. But resistance movements, this is how they start, from a small few people, and then you can expand, and actually after a while you can do something serious and get serious results. But it starts with information. So
I'm sorry to say we're out of time, but that was wonderful.
Let me just finish in about 10 seconds. I need to thank David that just reminded me of the fact that I'm out of time, and Liz. And we have someone from Palestine online. So we are in solidarity with the Palestinian people in Iran, and I think all justice-seeking people, whether they're in Middle East or outside, are doing the same solidarity with Palestine. I didn't go into Palestine because we have someone here. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you very much, Fawad. And I don't know, maybe you were able to post that link in the chat for people to access.
I'll do that.
And yes, we are very grateful that we have Fawad Baker from Palestine, who is going to be the next speaker after Kathy. So, and of course, I'm sure all our hearts are very much in solidarity with the suffering in Palestine at this time. So from the US, speaking on North Korea, Kathy Choi is the Director of Policy and Organizing for Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of activists mobilizing to end the Korean War, reunite families, and ensure feminist leadership and peace building. Kathy coordinates the Korean Peace Now grassroots network, launched in 2019 to organize communities in calling for demilitarization and lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. Her writing has been published in the Journal of Policy History and the Asian Pacific American Law Journal. She's based in Los Angeles and is the program committee co-chair for GYOPO, a collective of diasporic Korean cultural producers and arts professionals generating progressive, critical, intersectional, and intergenerational discourses, community alliances, and free educational programs. So welcome, Kathy. And again, thank you so much, Fawad, for your wonderful contribution in the middle of the night. But welcome, Kathy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Liz. I'm going to just share my screen to show some slides. Thank you to all the speakers thus far, and thank you all to the speakers to come. So I will be presenting on the impact of sanctions in North Korea. As Liz mentioned, I'm with Women Cross DMZ and Korea Peace Now Grassroots Network. In our work, we use feminist framing to highlight the impacts of the ongoing war in Korea and the need for replacing the armistice with a peace agreement. So I'll first start with this quote from Dr. Kee Park, who's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at Harvard Medical School. He has been to the DPRK, or North Korea, over 20 times. So he says, think about sanctions as warfare without bullets. What's happened in North Korea is that sanctions have been gradually ramped up from bullets to small bombs to artillery to missiles. They have been upped in the last 6 to 7 years to what we call sectoral sanctions. That's the nuclear bomb of sanctions. Why is that? Because it involves civilian economy. It is indiscriminate between civilian and military targets. So just to give a brief overview of a sanctions timeline on North Korea is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. It is subject to a combination of unilateral and United Nations sanctions that amount to an almost total ban on DPRK-related trade, investment, and financial transactions. While some countries have been imposing unilateral sanctions on the DPRK since as far back as the Korean War, traditionally dated 1950 to 1953, the UN Security Council has imposed increasingly stringent multilateral sanctions since 2006. But before getting into the development of this sanctions regime, we must first note the context of the Korean War to understand in which this regime developed. The Korean War, in the words of historian and legal scholar Samuel Moyn, was the most, quote, brutal war of the 20th century, measured by intensity of violence and per capita civilian death. In the Korean War, over 4 million people were killed, more than half of them civilians, and an estimated 2 million children orphaned. The US razed 80% of North Korea's cities to the ground, and as historian Bruce Cummings noted, showed, quote, next to no concerns for civilian casualties. In just a span of the 3 years, from 1950 to 53, the US dropped 32,000 tons of napalm, 635,000 tons of bombs on the Korean Peninsula. Altogether, more than were dropped in the Pacific Theater in World War II combined. The war has not officially ended. The peninsula is still divided, and 10 million families continue to be separated. The temporary ceasefire agreement signed in 1953 has not been replaced by a peace agreement, and the US has installed the third highest number of military bases in the world in Korea, including the largest overseas military base, Camp Humphreys, with 30,000 US troops stationed there. So it is against this backdrop that we now turn towards the sanctions regime. From the onset of the war and onwards, the US imposed unilateral sanctions through federal law, codified as Trading with the Enemy Act, followed by a string of presidential executive actions that confer authority to the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. Upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, North Korea pursued its own nuclear weapons program. This led to 2 rounds of diplomacy in 1994 and again in 2005. At both times, North Korea offering to return to nuclear non-proliferation status and US affirming normalization of diplomatic relations, and at times a promise of provision of energy aid. But both the 1994 and 2005 agreements collapsed, with North Korea accusing the US of making nuclear threats, restarting escalatory military exercises, maintaining sanctions. So here we turn now to the, quote, smart sanctions regime from 2006 to 2016. In 2006, North Korea tested its first nuclear device, which triggered the onslaught of multilateral UN sanctions. This first generation of sanctions, so-called smart sanctions, are based on the resolutions that are listed here. These resolutions aim to target the military in North Korea by prohibiting UN member nation states from providing the DPRK with weapons or weapons-related materials and technologies. However, it is important to note that these sanctions still affected non-elite, non-military populations, as the ban included what's called dual-use items that could be used for either military or civilian purposes. In terms of US unilateral sanctions from 2008 to 2016, during this period, US presidents signed multiple executive orders declaring national emergencies with respect to North Korea and granting OFAC authority to oversee the sanctions program. In 2016, Congress also passed the North Korea Sanctions and Policy Enhancement Act, which, among other things, required that the executive branch sanction authorities that were found to have provided support to North Korean weapons programs or any mineral and metal trade. Then we get to sectoral sanctions, which is what Dr. Key Park referred to as the nuclear bomb of sanctions. The nature of these UN sanctions started to change fundamentally in November 2016, when the Security Council responded to the 4th North Korean nuclear test with sanctions that indiscriminately targeted entire sections of the North Korean economy, regardless of whether there was a proven direct link to the nuclear program. The resolutions listed here from the November 2016 through the 2017 part of this timeline banned mineral trade, seafood, textile exports, agricultural products, machinery, and electrical equipment. The last 3 resolutions listed here from 2017 also heavily limited the DPRK's import of energy, banned the importation of industrial equipment, and prohibited joint ventures with North Korean entities, which was the main form of foreign investment at the time. And additionally required all UN member states to expel North Korean expatriate workers by December 2019. The US also continued to impose unilateral sanctions throughout this period, including Trump's Executive Order 13810, with the White House stating that the foreign financial institutions could do business with US or North Korea, but not both. In 2017, the US also instituted its travel ban to North Korea, which they just extended again this year. Throughout the development of this sanctions regime, the DPRK has been also progressively cut off from international capital. US unilateral sanctions combined with the risk assessment practices of global financial institutions have made it so that North Korea has now become a pariah in the international financial world. In 2022, Russia and China actually vetoed the UN Security Council's resolutions drafted by the US, which aim to strengthen sanctions on North Korea. Both Chinese and Russian ambassadors to the UN argued that new sanctions on North Korea would not stop its weapons program development and may instead increase its level of testing, and also cited the need for humanitarian aid in the DPRK. Nevertheless, the US has continued to pursue efforts of coordinated sanctions, trilateral efforts with South Korea, Japan, and European allies. And US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said last December that the US would seek to sanction North Korea in order to pressure and entice North Korea into giving up its nuclear arsenal. This year, Russia and China again maintained that what is now needed is not further sanctions, but instead renewed dialogue between North Korea and the United States. What's clear is that sanctions take a significant humanitarian impact on North Korean people, especially working class families, children, pregnant women, seniors living in remote areas. Even though UN exemptions purport to address the livelihood needs of people in the DPRK, sanctions restrict things like hand tools for agriculture, reproductive health kits, which include medication for treating symptoms like preeclampsia, nail clippers, UV lamps for disinfection, water heaters, X-ray machines. These exemptions are purported to be drafted to include those applications for aid made by international and NGOs carrying out assistance and relief activities. However, this notably excludes North Korean applicants for aids themselves. So, for example, a North Korean cooperative farm seeking to apply for what's called a WASH exemption, which is water, sanitation, hygiene. Any such goods that it would apply for example, from a Chinese importer would be stuck at the customs border for lack of proper documentation. Sanctions exemptions also fail to allow for NGOs, humanitarian groups to provide assistance. Unilateral US sanctions delay or outright block humanitarian shipments, and a 2019 UN panel itself noted that exemptions mechanisms are insufficient and subject humanitarian shipments to serial and prolonged delays, and also does not provide any mechanism, as mentioned, for DPRK civilian populations to apply for exemptions themselves. So finally, all of these US-based humanitarian organizations, even those face great difficulty in providing aid. In one example, an NGO called the Ignis Community, which has worked in North Korea since 2008, developed a spine rehab center in Pyongyang. It developed the capacity to treat about 500 patients, but given UN Resolution 2397, which banned the import of all metal to the DPRK, Ignis's ability to provide aid became significantly hampered. This had a serious deleterious effect on North Korean individuals, especially children with cerebral palsy. And further, UN sanctions and the US unilateral sanctions deterred Ignis's bank from doing business in the DPRK, leading to the closing of the organization's accounts. Finally, sanctions has a negative impact in particular on North Korean women's health, freedom, and autonomy. North Korea has a nationalized healthcare system, which has historically afforded women access to substantial maternal health care. And North Korea has also maintained the same percentage of its GDP spending on healthcare, even throughout the development of its nuclear weapons program, at about 6 to 7%, compared to an average expenditure of 5.4% in other low and middle income countries. However, sanctions have been deleterious to the health of women in North Korea by preventing the access to essential hygiene, sanitation, and health resources. Pregnant women in North Korea do not have access regularly to emergency reproductive health kits that contain critical life-saving drugs, for example, medication to treat postpartum hemorrhage and control excessive bleeding, and magnesium sulfate, which is used to treat preeclampsia. These restrictions are due to sanctions and funding shortfalls. Further, the sanctions regime also impedes access to safe drinking water and sanitation facilities by prohibiting any import of steel and technology transfers, which are necessary to construct such facilities. Women's safety and their livelihoods are more likely also to be violated in under-resourced states that are sanctioned. The economic pressure of sanctions risks exacerbating rates of domestic violence, sexual violence, and the trafficking and prostitution of women. Sanctions continually put women's lives at risk, given the country's dire economic and food situation, pushing women into spaces and activities where they are more vulnerable to assault or exploitation. The ongoing military conflict additionally leaves women vulnerable to assault and exploitation in a highly militarized society. Sanctions are also limiting, especially women's participation in the market economy. They directly interfere with the livelihood of North Korean women by targeting sectors in which women are heavily represented in the workforce. For example, in the textiles industry, where women represent 82% of workers, and retail trade, where women represent about 89% of workers, these industries are heavily sanctioned by both the UN multilateral and US unilateral sanctions. So in conclusion, the broad sanctions regime that have just been outlined in the context of this unresolved 70-year ongoing war is not only ineffective, but is also inhumane. The Korean War will not be resolved through more sanctions, military pressure, or isolation, but by building trust through dialogue and negotiation. Humanitarian issues, further, must be decoupled from negotiations over North Korea's nuclear program, and at a minimum, any sanctions must be modified to allow for the timely delivery of humanitarian aid to those who need it most. A peace agreement is the best path forward to achieving peace on the Korean Peninsula, and in US Congress right now, we have a bill introduced, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, HR 1369, which currently has 35 co-sponsors. So I'll just share this last slide, which has some further online reading at the bottom, and I can share those links in the chat as well. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was just so interesting and learning so much. And I'd just like to mention the film that was made about women crossing the DMZ, and you might like to put something about that in the chat as well, because that's really worthwhile watching.
Yes,
So,
it's called Crossings, and I'll be sure to include that in the chat.
Thank you. So, our next speaker, Fuad Baker from Palestine, and it's so wonderful to have you with us today, Fuad, especially at this very, very distressing and worrying time for you and your family and your people and everybody, and so many of us here. Fuad is a member of the International Criminal Court Bar Association and the head of the legal department at the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He is a Palestinian refugee based in Lebanon and has studied electromechanical engineering and international law. Welcome, Fuad.
Thank for you and all appreciation to the human rights figures and salutes to all free peoples who reject the injustice and appraise the struggle of Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Syria, Iraq, and all peoples who suffer from American imperialism and its ally, the Zionist organization, which support the rights of Palestinian peoples. First, I am talking now under the attack of Israeli of Gaza Strip and the south border in Lebanon. First, the United States government imposes wide-ranging sanctions and dozens of countries punishing populations in violation of the Geneva Convention in order to influence or overthrow their government, even though this is never the result. But the result is terrible suffering and death. But in Palestine...
See you now. You're on mute, Fuad.
Okay, sorry, because the electricity. But in Palestine, the situation is completely different because the United States of America supports the survival of the Israeli occupation in the occupied Palestinian territories, encouraged war crimes and violation of the 4 Geneva Conventions, and sends military weapons to support the Israeli occupation instead of imposing sanctions on Israel. It helps to besiege the Gaza Strip and the Palestinian people who are struggling to end the Israeli occupation of their lands and the right to self-determination and establish their independent, fully sovereign state of Palestine with Jerusalem as its capital, and to return of refugees as stipulated the United Nations resolution. When we talk about the Israeli siege of the Gaza Strip, it is precisely what the Israeli Defense Minister Gallant said yesterday, that I will prevent water, electricity, and food supplies to human animals, which means the human animals is the Palestinian people. Why was he not condemned by the international community? The Israeli blockage policy supported by the United States of America of the Gaza Strip led to a real catastrophe at all economic, social, and life levels, which increased after the construction of the Israeli separation wall in 2002, which was condemned by the International Court of Justice in 2004, as well as after Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005 and imposing its control by sea, land, and air over Gaza Strip, which means a comprehensive blockage through which Israel practices the policy of closing border crossing, controlling goods, services of foodstuffs, the policy of closing border crossing, controlling goods, service of foodstuffs entering the Gaza Strip, and reducing the productive capabilities of the Palestinian people. Israel reduced the quantities of gasoline, diesel, gas, and the fuel used to generate the electrical power for the Gaza Strip, which resulted in an almost permanent power outage, negatively affecting the life of residents, water and sewage networks, and infrastructures. Israel also restricted financial transfers to the Gaza Strip, prohibited the entry of foreign currencies and dealing with Israel's banks, and canceled the customs code of the Gaza Strip, in addition to imposing control on fishing and restricting Palestinians from cultivating their lands after Israel bulldozed agriculture lands and destroyed agriculture property, irrigation networks, and water pumps, and imposing severe restrictions on the import of agriculture sector needs and agriculture equipment. Israel freezes the Palestinian Authority's tax revenues, which are known as clearance revenues, which it earns on behalf of the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian economy has become subject to the Israeli market, as the Paris economic protocol gave Israel advantages that made it completely control Palestinian markets and trade, and deprived the Palestinian people of benefiting from it. Unemployment in Gaza Strip reaches 60% due to restrictions imposed on the Palestinian workforce. 80% of the population is below the poverty line, and in light of the continued economic blockage, there is food insecurity in the Gaza Strip, reaching a rate of 79%. Israel imposed harsh conditions on the import of medical equipment, medicines, and ambulances, and deprives Palestinian patients of treatment outside the Gaza Strip. At the level of education, Israel has isolated the participation of Palestinian universities in Gaza Strip from the international universities, and their participation in scientific and research conferences, and has tightened travel restrictions for students who wish to complete postgraduate studies outside the Gaza Strip. After the Aqsa flood operation carried out by the Palestinian resistance, Israel banned everything in Gaza Strip. I am talking about banning water, food, electricity, fuel. Everyone must move for the sake for civilians, and put pressure on governments to prevent this old and renewed siege in a brutal and deadly manner for civilians. The Palestinian people face a colonial regime mixed with an Israel apartheid regime led by fascist and extremist right-wing government headed by Benjamin Netanyahu, whose policy is based on the expansion of settlement, demolition of homes, displacement of Palestinians, Judaization of Jerusalem, the annexation of Palestinian land, in addition to the daily raids on Palestinian cities, and the killing of children, women, youth, and the elderly, and refrain from applying the international law and international legitimacy resolutions. Under the international law, the siege constitutes an act of war and is regulated in accordance with the law of self-defense, since Israel is an occupying power recognized by the international community and in accordance with the text of international legitimacy resolution. The siege
Howard, you're frozen again. Are you back now?
How? Sorry, did you hear me?
Yes.
Can you repeat your last sentence? Thank you.
Okay. After the Palestinian resistance incursion into the illegal Israeli settlement in violation of international law that are located on the border of Gaza Strip, it is reaction to the Israeli siege of the Gaza and the human suffering that the Palestinian experiencing under occupation, oppression, deprivation, poverty, and unemployment. The international community bears responsibility. Failure to take the necessary measures to end the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories and implement of the resolution international legitimacy. Recently, the Palestinian issue has no longer been the focus of attention, and the international community, which has largely ignored it, rather it transformed the Palestinian-Israeli conflict from a conflict over land and identity to improving to the standard of living and easing the siege imposed by the Palestinian, which Israel has also not implemented. And can you imagine what it would mean with the Israeli occupation forces to storm Palestinians' houses and bring with them a decision from the Israeli military court to evacuate his house, and the pretext that a Jewish settler process identification papers issued by the Israeli intelligence agency that he was owned this house for 6,000 years. Can you imagine the true extent of the crime assassinating journalists? Can you imagine the extent injustice and suffering Palestinian families? Yes, the Palestinian people don't want political settlement, but what they really want to live in dignity and to live in the freedom. Why does the international community condemn the Palestinian people's reaction to the injustice of the occupation instead condemning the action of the Israeli occupation crimes against him? So the Palestinians have been waiting for the Israel be tried its crimes for 75 years. Why did the Donald Trump administration impose sanctions on the prosecutor of International Criminal Court, Fatou Bensouda? It is not because she announced the opening of an investigation into the war crimes committed by Israel in 2014. Why the American and European countries condemn the non-violent struggle of the Palestinians? Why do they enact parliamentary laws to criminalize the boycott of Israel, BDS movement? And why do they accuse the Palestinian people of anti-Semitism when they oppose the racist and fascist Israeli policy? Why did you not support the prisoners' hunger, strike, and free them from the oppression of the jailer and executioner? Why did you not take action with Israel accused Palestinian human rights organization that exposed the Israel's violation of terrorism? Finally, there is no real peace without justice, and there is no real peace without the Palestinian people obtaining their legitimate, inalienable national rights that constitute a primary rule in international law, which is ending of the occupation of their land, the right of self-determination, the establishment of their independent state with Jerusalem as capital, and right of refugees. Yes, we are resistance fighters, not terrorists. We will continue to struggle by all means until our land liberated of our freedom and full national rights are achieved. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Fawad, and your very, very impassioned plea. It's very, very close to home at the moment for you. And, you know, as I mentioned, all of us are very much, I think, feeling very, very deeply and in distress for what's going on. And as you mentioned, there's no peace without justice. Justice underlines everything. So thank you so much. And there'll be some questions after our final speaker, and I'd like to give a very warm welcome to Ramon Labanina from Cuba. Ramon is the Vice President of the National Association of Economists and Accountants of Cuba, and he's one of the Cuban 5 who spent 16 years in prison in the United States on a trumped-up charge. So along with your 4 other comrades who are spread around the US. Welcome, Ramon, and thank you so much for joining us today. We have a presentation pre-recorded.
Antes tenemos...
Saludos para todos.
Hello, everyone.
Contra Cuba.
The sanctions of the United States
masiva, flagrante y sistemática de los derechos humanos de los cubanos.
Human rights of the Cubans.
La vida, el derecho a la alimentación y a la salud, el derecho a elegir libremente su sistema social. Y se ejerce a través de un entramado muy complicado de leyes que ya están codificadas dentro del Congreso de Estados Unidos. Estas leyes son violatorias del derecho internacional, son extraterritoriales, son leyes que clasifican como genocidio de Estado y también como una declaración de guerra económica en tiempos de paz. Cabe señalar que desde el propio triunfo de la Revolución de 1959 ya la administración norteamericana tomó medidas de embargo contra Cuba, limitándolo en la cantidad de la cuota azucarera que Cuba preferencialmente vendía a Estados Unidos y de la limitación de adquirir muchos de los productos que venían desde Estados Unidos a Cuba y solamente en que se pudiera adquirir alimentos y medicinas. El entramado de leyes es muy complicado, como decía anteriormente, y por ejemplo hay leyes como la ley de comercio con el enemigo que data del año 1917, estamos hablando de la Primera Guerra Mundial. Cuba es el único país del mundo que hasta hoy, en este momento, se le aplica esta ley. Esta es la ley de la asistencia exterior de 1961, la proclama presidencial 3447, emitida el 3 de febrero de 1962 por el presidente John F. Kennedy en plena crisis de los misiles, cuando declaró el embargo total a Cuba, el embargo naval y el embargo total a Cuba. Las regulaciones para el control de activos cubanos en el Departamento del Tesoro en 1963, otra de las leyes que lo componen. La ley para la administración de las exportaciones en 1979, con un epígrafe en el control de la seguridad nacional. Las regulaciones para la administración de las exportaciones la Ley para la Democracia o Ley Torricelli de 1992, que quiero hacer un paréntesis aquí, es una de las leyes más conocidas porque sanciona a todos los barcos que toquen puertos cubanos a que no pueden ir a puertos norteamericanos un periodo de 6 meses. Está también la infame Ley Burton de 1996, llamada Ley para la Libertad y la Solidaridad Democrática Cubana. Esta ley codifica y anula los poderes que tiene el presidente de Estados Unidos para ir poco a poco desmantelando el bloqueo. De manera tal que es solamente el Congreso que lo puede hacer. Además de eso, establece un protectorado en Cuba que decidiría cuándo quitar el bloqueo, establece regulaciones para que personas que eran dueños de propiedades en Cuba pudieran demandar a empresas, organismos nacionales e internacionales, e incluso a otras personas en las cortes de Estados Unidos, que hoy tiene sobre esa propiedad, tienen derecho a usar esa propiedad. Está la sección 211 de la Ley de Asignaciones Suplementarias y la Emergencia Fiscal del año 1999 y la Ley de Reforma de las Sanciones Comerciales y Ampliación de las Exportaciones del 2000. Cabe señalar que este entramado de leyes está aplicándose en toda su extensión y nunca se ha flexibilizado. Otro aspecto también es el hecho de ubicar a Cuba en la lista de países patrocinadores del terrorismo. Primero, es una aberración total, una ofensa contra el pueblo cubano, porque si alguien ha sufrido del terrorismo y el terrorismo de Estado de Estados Unidos es Cuba. Esta ley es extremadamente dañina, en primer lugar porque no permite el uso de un solo dólar que Cuba pueda utilizar en ninguna transacción bancaria o financiera internacional. Los bancos son sancionados severamente y las empresas que intentan negociar con Cuba para impedir el pago o complica muchísimo hacer el pago de cualquier tipo de intercambio que Cuba tenga. Como ejemplos, tenemos muchos de cuántos bancos han sido sancionados por esta ley, o sea, por ubicar a Cuba en esta lista. Lo otro es que es una ley que atemoriza a los inversionistas. O sea, las personas como tal, cuando al hacer Cuba ubicado en esta lista, es considerado país riesgo y por tanto los potenciales inversionistas tienen miedo de venir a Cuba. Y por otro, en otro orden de cosas, o sea, estamos en ese sentido perdiendo mucha inversión extranjera directa que ha descendido sustancialmente debido a la aplicación de esta medida. Y por otro lado, a ser país riesgo también, los pocos créditos que Cuba puede utilizar o créditos que Cuba puede, digamos, de alguna manera adquirir, se le aplica un 9% más de interés que al resto de los países del mundo. Ahora, ¿qué daño o cuánto daño nos ha hecho el bloqueo? Es muy difícil de calcular, pero hemos hecho estudios profundos sobre todo lo que Cuba ha dejado de adquirir o daños que se nos han hecho desde el punto de vista económico, contable, que nos permite reflejar en datos. Y lo otro es el orden espiritual, el orden de lo que sufre un pueblo por estas medidas, porque eso es incuantificable. Para poner solamente un ejemplo muy clarificador, a precios corrientes, los daños acumulados durante 6 décadas, o sea, si sacamos las cuentas en estas 6 décadas europeos, ascienden a la cifra astronómica de 410.800 millones Tomando en cuenta la depreciación del dólar frente al valor del oro, esto representaría 1.326.432 millones de dólares. Solo en los primeros 7 meses del 2021, para traer datos más frescos, este periodo que estamos viviendo, el bloqueo ocasionó pérdidas a Cuba en el orden de 2.557 millones de dólares, lo cual representa una afectación promedio de más de 365 millones de dólares mensuales y más de 12 millones de dólares diarios, o sea, 12 millones de dólares diarios. ¿Cuánto no hubiéramos podido hacer nosotros con esa cifra si lo hubiéramos tenido? En sectores como la salud, desde solamente enero a julio del 2021, el costo fue de más de 113 millones, en educación más de 30 millones, deporte más de 2 millones, en cultura más de 19 millones, en la industria biotecnológica y farmacéutica 102.943.600, en turismo más de 11 millones, en energía y minas más de 136 millones. En el sector bancario y financiero, más de 167.800 millones. En los primeros 14 meses del gobierno de Biden, la cifra alcanzó la astronómica medida de 6.364 millones de dólares. Eso equivale a más de 15 millones de dólares diarios y mensualmente a más de 454 millones de dólares. Ese es el costo cuantificable, pero los daños hechos al pueblo cubano por sufrimiento, por hambre, por dificultades económicas diarias a las cuales el bloqueo nos obliga, son incuantificables. Todo esto fuera poco. Estas medidas de bloqueo que nunca han cesado. Bueno, todavía en el último periodo, desde el año 2020 hasta la actualidad, las medidas se han todavía vuelto más agresivas, medidas más estrangulantes de la economía cubana. Por ejemplo, el expresidente Donald Trump en el año 2020 impuso 243 medidas nuevas al bloqueo. Pero no son cualquier medida, son medidas que puntualmente castigan a empresas y entidades cubanas que de verdad aportan de manera significativa al Producto Interno Bruto cubano. O sea, lo que de verdad, aquellas empresas que de verdad aportan al erario el crecimiento y el sustento de la población y el crecimiento del país. Son medidas que buscan por todos los medios estrangularnos, no dan un respiro alguno. Donde quiera que ven algún tipo de avance cubano, pues vienen y obstaculizan tanto intercambio como posibilidades de negocio, como posibilidades de inversiones, y sin duda nos está haciendo un tremendo daño. Ninguna de estas medidas ha sido revertidas por la administración de Biden. Ha habido muchas declaraciones, pero en realidad estas medidas se mantienen intactas hoy en día e incluso se vuelven aún más severas. Cabe destacar el periodo del 2020-2021 con la COVID, el momento más difícil que vivió no solamente Cuba, la humanidad, porque eso se aparejó también con la crisis económica internacional. En aquellos momentos, Estados Unidos demostró el carácter más cruel y asesino del bloqueo. Prohibió que entraran incluso valores de oxígeno para nuestros niños, para la población. Prohibió y bloqueó barcos con implementos médicos, aviones que venían hasta de China con recursos para medir los grados de enfermedad de la COVID o implementos que nos permitían sobrevivir la enfermedad. O sea, demostraron todo lo más cruel de esta política. No tuvieron la menor muestra de por lo menos humanidad en estos momentos en que Cuba estaba sufriendo, y al contrario, fueron todavía más estrictos y consecuentes con su política genocida de tratar de exterminar al pueblo cubano. Y además de todo esto, cabe destacar que, unido a estas medidas cada vez más severas, están empeñados en tumbar el gobierno cubano, destruir el gobierno cubano a través de los golpes suaves. Cuba sin duda ahora está siendo sometida a una inmensa campaña en los medios audiovisuales, en los medios alternativos, en las redes, a través de mentiras y manifestaciones y tergiversaciones que nada tienen que ver con nuestra realidad y que buscan crear un estado de ánimo, digamos, desaliento de nuestra población y que convoquen al pueblo a rebelarse, cosa que el cubano sabe y hemos aprendido en estos años a combatir. Esa es la realidad. Todas estas medidas siguen estando intactas y por ello, por lo cruel del bloqueo, por lo infame, por lo injusto, es que le seguimos solicitando su ayuda y su apoyo internacional, derrotarlos en las Naciones Unidas y que nos apoyen como lo están haciendo hasta ahora. Cuba seguirá adelante. El bloqueo y todos los retos que él nos impone los sabremos ir sorteando, porque nunca nos vamos a vencer y arrodillar ante la prepotencia imperial, ni nunca nos rendiremos ni por hambre ni por necesidades ante el imperio del mundo. En esta misma exposición la anexo con un PowerPoint donde pueden tener todos esos elementos, incluso alguna otra información que puede ser de interés y está a su interés y exposición. Así que muchísimas gracias.
Thanks very much to all the participants, all our wonderful speakers, Luis and Fouad and Kathy and Fouad and Ramon, for those wonderful presentations. And now we have some time for questions, and I'm going to hand over to our Executive Director, David Swanson, to field some questions to the speakers. Thank you, David.
Well, I would say please continue to put good questions into the chat, and we will do our best to pass them along to the speakers. If we can maybe start with a question for Fouad Baker, because we have uncertain electricity in that location and want to get a question to him while we can. Fouad, there have been reports of people trying to flee Gaza and then being bombed, and being told to flee Gaza and then being bombed. Are people effectively imprisoned? Are people able to come and go? Are people trying to leave?
No, first in Gaza, it's very hard to live in this time. It's a big prison. We can call it a big prison, and I think this big prisons, it's the Israeli prisons, If you can to imagine, we have there are dozens of martyred prisoners whose bodies are still kept in refrigerators and subject to the Israeli blackmail. For this reason, so I cannot go externally. I imagine what happened in Gaza, but now the situation of Gaza is very hard.
Understood. We had a similar question in the chat for Luis Miguel Delgado. What connection do you see between sanctions in Venezuela and migration out of Venezuela? As you know, many people try to come to the United States and are punished for doing that, even if they are fleeing U.S. punishment of the population where they came from.
Okay. Bueno, muchas gracias por la pregunta.
Thank you very much for your question. As a matter of fact, yes, there are indicators, surveys on these two variables. In Venezuela, never in history we had such a phenomenon as this of migration. For the first time in history, we have this phenomena, which is a massive or very grave immigration. Around 1.5 million people had to immigrate by force because of economical reasons. To have an idea, minimum wage in Venezuela was the highest in Latin America, over $300. And after the sanctions, after 2015, the wage reached, the minimum wage was the equivalent to $1 per month. So we know that the organizations calculate that around 1 to 3.5, it's extreme poverty. So imagine we were at $1 per month per worker. So certainly
El ingreso no solamente de las personas, sino del Estado.
There was a great impact on the economy, and our salary went from $300 to the equivalent of $1. So certainly this has affected the economy of the country and has caused people to massively immigrate from 1 to 5 million. And the idea that Venezuela was a failure state was promoted, that Venezuela was a country without future. And with that argument, people were brainwashed, and the first migration was of professionals, doctors, nurses, engineers, network experts, technology experts. After that, there was the technical migration, and then a third wave of immigration, which was basically non-skilled workers, cooks, more domestic work with less education. But there was depredation of the demographics of Venezuela. We were one of the countries with the highest population of young people, and half of those was impoverished and forced to immigrate.
Thank you. Maybe we can ask a question of Kathy. There, Luis, I'm just going to click mute because there's a lot of noise where you are, and you can unmute when you're ready to talk again. Kathy, there are a number of questions in the chat along the lines of whether sanctions actually kill more than war. How can sanctions be forbidden? Or can the world sanction the United States, or can we end the veto power and democratize the UN? What can be done?
Well, I think that there's just a lot of things that just got laid out there, so I'm trying to organize it mentally. I think that the regime that is currently being placed, the sanctions regime that is currently being placed onto North Korea and has the economy and the position that it's in, is the combination of both the multilateral UN sanctions based on the resolutions, which have now hit the roadblock given the veto power within the UN Security Council, which was exercised last year by the Chinese and Russian ambassadors. And then we have the US unilateral sanctions, which are manifest through president executive power. So that's presidential executive orders. And then the congressional bill that was passed in 2016. So from my vantage point, as a US citizen person based here, heart of empire in the United States, the tools at my disposal are organizing US-based communities, pushing electeds to change U.S. policy, which many have agreed is its failed policy, has not led to de-escalation, has not led to denuclearization, has only aggravated the situation and led to further militarization. And that's why we push for HR 1369, the Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. It was first introduced as a resolution in Congress, HRES 152, that had dozens of congressional co-sponsors, then introduced as a bill, HR 3446, which had 50 co-sponsors, and now has been reintroduced earlier this year, and has 35 co-sponsors. And we're currently engaged in an advocacy campaign to push the bill. So I know a lot of us might have disillusionment about U.S. Congress, the federal government, but that's where at least we see our work through the grassroots, US-based grassroots network plugging in to, change the Overton window of what is possible, feasible with respect to Korea, to highlight that the ongoing war leads to the further militarization, current precarity. And the bill addresses the peace agreement, addresses the travel restrictions, addresses developing liaison offices between North and South Korea. And so that's just one avenue of advocacy. And then the other avenues of advocacy, I think, as pointed out earlier by Dr. Izadi, I think it was just further education of the reality of what's on the ground. I think North Korea is among the most, if not the most vilified nation state in the global community. And so education about what sanctions do, the history of the war, the history of the governments, understanding the impact of sanctions on everyday people. I think a lot of it is narrative change, in addition to building political will, translating that into some sort of tangible action. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Terrific. A question to Fawad Izadi, who's now stayed up all night in China, and wanted to ask, there are people apparently blaming this allowance by the US of Iran to have some of its own money for the current war in Gaza, and as well as others in the US media blaming Iran in various ways for this war. And there's this problem that nations with oil have been denied their own wealth for so many years, and everyone wants justice, and we all want these oil-rich nations to be able to have their own darn money. And yet, as a species, if we don't stop burning oil, we're all cooked. So what is the right thing to do here?
Moving away from fossil fuels is obviously an objective that we have to pursue. But we are not at that stage now. And that's issue number one. The second issue is that if money belongs to a country and a nation, that should not be blocked for illegal sanctions. Unilateral US sanctions are illegal under international law because they violate the principle of sovereignty. Whether it's Korea, South Korea, or Iraq, or other countries that owe Iran money, if the governments of these countries want to pay that money, and they do, because they want to have trade with Iran, and if you don't pay the money that you owe, the trade doesn't happen. If they decide to do that, then they should have the right to engage in economic activities without interference from a third country. If Chinese companies want to trade with Iran, they need to follow Chinese law, not the law that was passed in Washington. So when United States imposes secondary sanctions on other countries, that is a violation of international law. The US is violating the sovereignty of that country because the companies in China should be listening to the Chinese government, not the American government. So the short answer to that question is, while we are trying to move away from fossil fuels, which it should be a goal for everyone, as you said, if we continue burning fossil fuels, everybody would be in difficulty. The countries that are actually causing environmental damage are the same countries that are engaging in this type of illegal sanctions for the most part. So United States historically has caused more damage to the environment than any other country because of the history of industrialization and pollution. And the United States is actually leading these type of illegal sanctions. So that's basic. That's the basic idea, to make sure that ordinary citizens are not suffering because of this type of practices that are illegal under international law.
Well, it's kind of a side issue to this topic, but it's rather sad and tragic that we aren't at the point of moving away from fossil fuels, because it does mean we are all going to die, which seems like it's not really a side issue in any topic. But if we could go to Fuad Baker and ask in 2 minutes, what do you think people can most do around the world to help Palestine at the moment? People who see the news and understand it and are horrified, what can they do to help?
Now all of the borders in Gaza Strip are closed. The Israeli attacked the borders of Rafah between Egypt and Gaza, and he tell for the Egypt state, when you want to give any help for the Gaza Strip, we will attack the Egypt. Donc, so now we are in the expansion is largest, and we don't have any scenario what can happen, what will happen in the future. I think this is a long time of war. I think to stopping the fire now, and the freedom of prisoners and to the liberation of Palestine.
Thank you. It's it would be wonderful for U.S. weapons companies to have a war between Israel and Egypt, the number 2 and number 3 recipients of the opposite of sanctions, the free weapons. Liz suggested that while our speaker from Cuba had to appear by video because of internet issues, we do have with us Edgardo Valdez, who is an ambassador from Cuba. And I think if he's able to unmute and comment, it would be good to hear his thoughts on this conversation, and in particular, what can be done to end the sanctions on Cuba, because it's obviously not a presidential election. It's something else.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I have to say that for us, it is very important to participate in this kind of events. As you saw, Lavallino was not able to participate in the same way that the rest of us, because the sanctions of the U.S. forbid Cubans to use many of the weapons or the resources that we have available for other people to develop our communications struggle. It is very important for us, for the world, to know about the sanctions or blockade against Cuba and other countries. And international solidarity has been really important for Cuba during many years. The first goal of the U.S. blockade was to isolate Cuba and to create difficulties in order to be able to provoke a change in the government. And they haven't been able to do that. On the contrary, they have been isolated at the UN. Next November, we will have a new vote on the UN resolution at the General Assembly, the resolution that is called the necessity of ending the U.S. economic, commercial, and financial blockade against Cuba. And every year, only the U.S. and Israel vote against this resolution. So to continue talking about this and explaining the reality of Cuba and the rest of the countries that are under unilateral sanctions or the coercive measures by the United States is extremely important for all of us. And I thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to participate in this event.
Thank you for being here. We have about 10 minutes left, and I wonder if we could get any final comments, especially from Luis or Kathy or Fawad on what can be done. We've heard about educating and lobbying for legislation. There's also protesting. There's also breaking these sanctions and these blockades with humanitarian trips, which is a tactic that has been used in the past. Does anyone want to suggest some steps that should be taken that we haven't touched on yet?
Bueno, una idea muy breve. Yo creo que
a very brief idea, I believe, could be that the world should be horrified by the severity of the genocide that is happening based on sanctions. I was doing math, and there is an international organization in Washington that calculates that in Venezuela, we have 20,000 people dying due to the sanctions, the so-called sanctions from the United States and Europe. It means that in around 9 years, 20,000 per 9, it's an amount equivalent to the death generated by the nuclear bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. That's the destructive power of these so-called sanctions. So we have to explain the world that this is not just any measure, law measure, but that it is basically a nuclear bomb designed against the population, the base population.
Kathy, did you want to add anything?
Keep going. Okay. I just will echo the point made that I think all of us here on this webinar probably are somewhat further along than many, if not most, of folks in global community, at least especially in the United States. I'll speak just for the United States. And I think engaging at every turn and working to shift the paradigm about thinking about sanctions is not a preferable nonviolent alternative, but as Dr. Delgado just mentioned, that it is a, as you just said, the nuclear bomb, as Dr. Key Park also just suggested, that the idea that especially sectoral sanctions as currently being visited on North Korea are violent, deadly, inhumane, and also ineffective. And I think that understanding that and continuing to educate on that is very important. And I will also add just on the, I think you mentioned, David, on maybe like people-to-people contact, understanding the travel ban that currently the United States has placed on U.S. citizens to North Korea, that no U.S. passport is currently valid to travel to North Korea, that you have to apply for a special validation passport. State Department discretion is unfettered. There's, no due process, no sense of explanation or elaboration of the criteria, and working to advocate to change that kind of draconian policy is also absolutely essential for folks in the United States to understand the realities of what is happening in North Korea, and to also promote more people-to-people contact.
Yes, indeed. And we should at least be able to get people from North Korea on this kind of event that doesn't involve traveling, but it's hard to do. Thank you. Fawad Izadi, did you want to add anything? We're quickly running out of time here.
Right. It's obvious that the people in countries like Venezuela and Cuba and Iran and Palestine and Lebanon, one reason Fawad is having difficulty with electricity in Lebanon is because Lebanon is also under sanctions. So these people are suffering. That's obvious. We have talked about it for the last 2 hours. But the people in the countries that are putting the sanctions, people in the United States and a number of European countries that are responsible for these sanctions, they also suffer from sanctions. And they are not suffering as much as the other people in receiving ends of sanctions. But people in the United States suffer from sanctions because they suffer from wrong foreign policy goals. And when you engage in foreign policy goals that is detrimental to others, that's going to affect the country that is engaging in this type of activities. So it is in the interest of Americans and the people in UK and others in Europe to also end sanctions for self-fulfilling reasons, for reasons that deal with the interests of Americans and others. World Beyond War is one organization, and there are many other NGOs in the United States, many church groups, many other people who engage in civil activities. But we see a handful of organizations, exceptional organizations like World Beyond War, that are talking about this issue. And the question that probably we don't have the answer for at the moment, we don't have time to answer. The question is why other NGOs and other organizations are not talking about sanctions. And if we manage to have an answer for that question, that could be the topic of your next webinar, that why only few organizations like World Beyond War are doing this and others are not doing it. Because it's in the interest of the countries that are leveling these sanctions to also be aware of what's going on. So let me finish with a question the same way you started.
I think it's an excellent question, and I wonder whether it's the same question as why so few organizations oppose war, or whether it's a different question. But maybe I should hand this back to Liz, who is our moderator here, and for my part, say thank you to our wonderful speakers and questioners.
Yes, thank you, David. I think this has been such an interesting webinar with so many perspectives around the world and so many united themes as well. And I agree, it's really important that we educate ourselves, educate each other, and this webinar will be available to you to share around your networks and reproduce. And so as well as thanking our fantastic speakers today, Louise, Fawad and Kathy, Fawad and Ramon, also thanking to Gabrielle and David and your wonderful audience who've taken 2 hours out of your day to come and learn and to be with us together. So it's been a really enriching experience, and I would just like to say thank you so much. Please share, please keep asking the questions, taking actions, writing the letters, and we are very much in solidarity, and justice is the basis of peace. So thank you. Have a wonderful day, evening, morning, night.
Sorry
Hola.
for bothering. I have one addition. If you want anyone to support the Palestine or the Palestinian civilian people, he can contact me. I can help him how we can give the support of the Gaza Strip.
And we can send anything you send us, including your contact information, to everyone who registered for this event. And any resources, reports that have been discussed and mentioned in the chat, we can send to everyone in an email. So we wish you very much the best, Fouad, and thank you to you and to Fouad Izadi and to Kathy and to Luis and to Ramon and to Liz and to Gabrielle and to everyone.
Well, perhaps, Fouad, you would like to put your email in the chat in case anybody would like to contact you immediately. Okay, that's it. All that's from us. Bye-bye. Thank you. Au revoir.